Hello, and welcome back to EECS 367, Introduction to Autonomous Robotics, and Robotics 320, Robot Operating Systems. We're now at our 16th lecture of the winter 2022 semester at the University of Michigan. We are at actually our second to last lecture in this recorded format for this semester. The topic of today's lecture is going to be on potential fields and how we can use potential fields to define navigation for our robots as an alternative to the path planning and motion planning algorithms that we've looked at up to this point. And so, as a reminder, you're going to have your final programming assignment and also the final overall assignment for the class is going to be released today, and you'll have 2 weeks to complete those. And so I would recommend starting early on those just so that you can finish those up in kind of a good place for the semester. But with that, let's get into today's material on potential fields for navigation. And so to start, I will minimize myself so we can all see the slide content.
All right. So to set up today's lecture, you'll recall that both in the last lecture but also earlier in the course, we've been looking at a variety of approaches to the problem of path planning and motion planning. And so on this slide here summarizes the set of approaches that we've looked at throughout this course. So you'll recall that a couple lectures ago we were looking at the bug algorithms for doing simply reactive-based control in motion planning. We've also talked about graph search algorithms, so depth first search, breadth first search, A-star. And then in last lecture we discussed sampling-based search. So we looked at probabilistic roadmaps and rapidly exploring random trees as ways in which you could apply these sampling techniques to construct roadmaps or trees within configuration space and then use those constructed data structures to approach the problem of motion planning. And in today's lecture, we're now going to talk about the final approach that we'll look at in this course, which is optimization-based approaches that perform local search in trying to solve the problem of motion planning. And so the set of topics then within this optimization-based planning that we're going to look at involve gradient descent, potential fields, simulated annealing, and wavefront algorithms. So to get started, let's think about what is a potential field and what are some examples of potential fields to sort of get our intuition started. And so one really nice example of a potential field is the sort of coin donation cones. So if you're familiar with sort of museums tend to have these, or some maybe art galleries, where there will be this conical surface where you'll drop a coin down and it'll essentially roll and slide somewhat slowly in a controlled fashion until it finally dispenses into the sort of lower bin. And so this is a really nice illustration of what a potential field can do in terms of controlling the motion of an object within space. And so in this case, the object that it's controlling is simply a coin, but we would potentially want to ask within robotics how it is we could control our robots, right? So one kind of so in this particular case, the potential field is actually being generated by the force of gravity, right? So gravity is what is essentially adding force to the coin and controlling its motion. But we then could use this same concept for controlling potentially a planar robot, as was done in this example. So this is sort of a puzzle-like game where the human then can essentially change the configuration of the board, and in doing that, they can control the marble. And so you can see that by changing the configuration of the board, what they're doing is they're manipulating how the force of gravity is going to affect the motion of the marble, and ultimately lead the marble from some starting configuration to the goal configuration. And so this particular example should look very familiar to us from our discussion of planar navigation and also robot soccer that we looked at from earlier in the semester. And so one thing then that this particular example might sort of motivate is how is it that we could potentially use this notion of a potential field to control our robots in a planar configuration space. And so recall then that the way we approached defining this problem was in the context of navigation. So when we looked at robot soccer, for example, we considered this a very similar setup where we'd have this planar configuration space where the robot would be given some start location within that plane and a goal location defined within that plane, and then our job was to try and find a path through the planar configuration space that would lead it from the start to the goal. And so if we wanted to apply this like a potential field to this planar space in order for us to define this motion plan, one way that we could think about that is by defining it in terms of sort of warmer and colder locations in the space. So similar to how in the marble example, by changing the orientation of the board, the human was able to sort of direct the marble in one direction or the other at each instant. What our potential field is going to do is it's going to define a similar basically desired change in configuration at each individual point within the plane. And so what we could do is we could say that our goal location should be sort of very, very warm, meaning like our robot should very much want to move towards that goal location, whereas our start location should be sort of very cold, like it should almost push the robot away, right? So if our robot was trying to move towards warmer locations in the potential field, then by defining the potential field in this way, our robot should sort of start from the colder location and then gradually try to move towards the warmer location. And so at each local point within the map, the robot can try and just kind of orient its directed motion such that it'll lead it towards this warmer goal location. And so the technical approach in terms of how it is that you can essentially implement this type of motion given a potential field has been constructed is using an algorithm that's referred to as gradient descent. And so the idea with gradient descent is if you define a potential field, what you can do is you can move according to that potential field such that you will essentially maximize your potential at the final configuration. And so using gradient descent, what we would like to see in this particular example is that the robot would continually move towards that warmer location until finally it actually reaches the maximal, the configuration space, the point in configuration space, which corresponds with the maximum potential, which would be at the goal location. So this then motivates the question of how it is we can define a potential field. So for our use, we're going to be defining potential fields as follows. So a potential field is a differentiable function defined over the configuration space that maps each configuration to a corresponding scalar energy value. And so because this is a differentiable function, at every possible configuration within configuration space, there will be a gradient defined where the gradient is the vector in configuration space that maximally increases that energy value, right, or that potential. And so using this definition then of a potential field, what we'll do is we'll define the goal configuration in conjunction with the potential field such that energy is minimized at the goal configuration. And so the way that this maps into the potential field is that the gradient of the potential function will be 0 at the goal configuration. And so then by descending this potential field, so that is by moving in the negative direction of the gradient, we can move towards the goal. And so this approach to moving within potential fields is what's referred to as gradient descent. So on this slide, we're illustrating on the left-hand side of the slide sort of a figure that illustrates what gradient descent will be performing, and then on the right-hand side we have pseudocode, which should look familiar given our current project 5 that we've been working on, where we were using gradient descent using the Jacobian transpose method to perform motion planning. So in this particular use case of gradient descent for potential fields, what we're going to do is we're going to essentially update our configuration. So in this diagram, so within this while loop, what we're going to do is, as long as we have not reached a portion of the potential field where the gradient is very, very small, so as long as the size of our gradient is above some set threshold, we're going to update our current configuration by taking our current configuration and then moving in the negative direction of the current gradient at the current configuration. And so we're going to scale that by some step length, just as we did in the Jacobian transpose method, and then move on to the next step of our gradient descent loop. And so the reason that we move in the negative direction is to ensure that we're decreasing our potential. So if you'll recall, on the last slide, we defined the goal configuration at the position such that the potential is minimized. So in this diagram, if this parabolic curve represents our potential field defined over configuration space, which would be along this horizontal axis, then our goal configuration would be defined at this point D, where the potential field is minimum. And so by stepping in the negative direction, what we'll do is we'll ensure that if we're at some given point and the gradient points in the positive direction, we'll then take a step in configuration space that is in the negative direction. So we'll be moving towards the goal configuration in that orientation. Whereas if we're at a point where the gradient is negative, once again, we'll move in the negative direction of that, which will then be correspondingly in the positive direction. So once again, we'll move towards the goal configuration. And so we assume that the derivative is pointing in the direction of steepest ascent away from the goal. So by taking the negative direction of that, we'll move. We'll be taking a step in the steepest descent towards the goal. So this notion of potential fields really is inspired by potential energy, right? So from physics, we define the potential energy as the energy that's stored within some physical system, where then the kinetic motion can be caused by the system that moves from some high potential energy state to a lower potential energy state. And so you might be familiar with this in the case of rigid body objects that are acting with respect to gravity, where the potential energy is defined as the mass times the height that the object exists within that gravitational field times the gravity at that particular position. And so this might be familiar to you. There also has been potential energy defined, for example, in the context of electric fields. So we can imagine a positively charged particle that follows some potential energy to a goal, where the path that it takes is based on the relative repelling force of other positively charged particles within the space, and also the attractive force of negatively charged particles. And so we can think about this notion of attraction and repulsion as being inspirations for how we can define potential fields for our robots, such that we could sort of design these kind of potential fields that would lead to smooth motion plans in a way that's sort of easy to implement and understand. So let's look now at an example of a convergent potential similar to the potential field that would have been applied in the case of the coin sort of donation cone. And let's sort of look at this example and consider how it is that we could implement this and use this for our robot operating systems. So we could consider this particular type of potential as a sort of a tractor landscape, where the starting configuration has some sort of high potential, and we would then want it to move towards the goal location that has some lower potential. And so we can think about that goal location as being then the basin of attraction within our potential field. And so we could imagine then that this would be useful for 2D potential field navigation, where in this diagram we're illustrating the combined configuration space with potential energy. So the horizontal plane defines the XY configuration space of the robot in 2 dimensions, and then the vertical axis in this figure with the corresponding color map of a manifold is showing then the potential at each point from that configuration space below it. And so using this basin of attraction, what we can do is we can motivate our robot to move towards the goal, where the goal configuration then is at that minimum point of potential energy. So in this diagram, the goal configuration is at the portion of the potential field that has that deep dark blue color, indicating like a low potential energy value. So if we were given then some start location, some start configuration, we could imagine that our gradient descent algorithm is going to move in roughly a straight line path down towards this basin of attraction. And so that's how we could use this type of a potential field within the context of 2D planar navigation. So let's consider then how it is if we wanted to use this type of potential field in navigation, and how it is we could actually implement this type of conical attractor. So to implement a cone attractor, what we're going to do is let's step through the actual way that we could define this potential field by defining an equation to represent the gradient of this potential field, because it's the gradient, right, that our gradient descent algorithm is going to be using for actual navigation, right, for actually deciding how the control should sort of move the robot. So the first thing we can do to calculate the gradient is to find the direction that points from the goal location towards the robot's current configuration given by Q. And so the reasoning behind this is that direction, so the direction that points from the goal to the robot configuration, is going to correspond with the gradient direction that points, that sort of ascends away from the goal, right? So given that, though, if we want our cone attractor to have essentially constant magnitude of gradient everywhere, we need to normalize that direction. So if we then take the length of that vector, right? So in this figure, we take first the vector pointing from the goal configuration to the robot's current configuration given at Q. So that gives us this vector. And then we take what's called the Euclidean norm of that vector, which will give us the distance between the goal and the current robot configuration. And we then divide the given vector by the calculated distance. And what that will do is it'll normalize the resulting vector that we've calculated such that it's what's referred to as a unit vector. So this resulting vector now will still point in the direction from the goal towards the robot's current configuration, right? So it'll still point in the direction that will increase potential, but it will now be guaranteed to have a length of 1 in this configuration space. And so given that, we now are pretty close to having defined our gradient. The one additional factor that we could include is if we want the particular slope of our cone to be steeper or shallower, we could then scale our calculated unit vector by some weight w to then give us our final definition of the gradient, which is shown on this slide here. Right, and so then just one thing to point out is that scale factor w, what that's going to do is it's going to control the steepness of this conical attractor that we've now defined in our potential field. So if you wanted a steeper cone, a steeper basically attractor, you could increase the weight, you could increase that w, and you would get a very steep curve. Or if you wanted a less steep cone of attraction, you could decrease that weight to get a cone that would have a less extreme slope. So given that we've now defined this relatively simple cone attractor, the next thing we might want to ask is whether or not we could modulate the range of a potential field. And so it turns out that we can. So in particular, what we can do is we can incorporate alternative functions outside of just that definition of a conical gradient to control how our robot would be attracted to the goal position. So for example, on this side, we're giving another definition of a potential field through defining the gradient, where you can see we've changed our definition of the gradient now to include this call to the exponential function. And so this expo function is one such that we can control the steepness or the smoothness of its increase by controlling the parameter of this particular function. And so this is one approach we could take to controlling the behavior of our robot by manipulating the actual potential field's definition by incorporating these other functions. The next thing that's fairly common to do with potential fields is to try and combine them, right? So given this cone attractor or given this bowl attractor that we just looked at, we're really only going to get behavior that moves just in a straight line path from the current configuration to the goal. But it might be in certain cases that we actually want these planners to have sort of multiple kind of objectives combined as they're performing plans, right? So one example of that would be like if you wanted to avoid obstacles or maybe coordinate with other robots within the configuration space. And so for doing that, you might want to approach that by this notion of combining multiple potentials. And so this is possible. So what we can do is we can think that if the output of a potential field is a vector, we could then, because the vector field is going to be closed under addition, what we can do is we can combine multiple potentials through vector addition. So if we take a given potential field or a given set of potential fields, we can then create a resultant combination of those by simply taking the sum of each of the individuals. And so as a result of that, you'll get then some mixture of those potential fields that controls then your final planner. So that's a way of kind of combining multiple objectives in this fashion. So let's now look at a use case for this incorporation of multiple potentials. So in the case we looked at to start with, within this robot soccer planar navigation scenario, there were no obstacles. And so a single conical attractor could successfully navigate from the current configuration to the goal configuration. But let's consider a case where actually we have multiple obstacles, where we would want to model these obstacles using repeller potential fields, but still have our robot be able to navigate to the goal, right? So in this case, we have this notion, or we have this question comes up, which is how are we going to deal with these repellers while still being able to ensure that our robot is motivated to move towards the goal? And so the way that we can do this is by using the definition of multiple potentials that we just looked at a few slides ago. So what we can do is we can define the overall potential field as being the summation of both the potential fields that attract the configuration towards the goal and the potentials that repel the configuration away from the obstacles. But of course, to do this, we would need to now define these repeller potentials. So let's look at how it is we could actually define these repeller potentials. So one approach we could take is we could simply define a conical repeller, where all we need to do is we can take our conical attractor and the gradient that we derived for our conical attractor, and we can simply flip the direction of that gradient. So instead of moving the robot sort of towards a goal, we can simply take the negative direction that we had calculated before, and we'll now move the robot away from the repeller. And we'll still have that conical behavior where the magnitude of this gradient will be constant. If instead you'd like the magnitude of the gradient to depend on the distance that the robot is from the obstacle, from the repeller, then you could similarly define a bowl repeller using the exp function like we did in the case of a bowl attractor, where once again the only difference is that you're just going to essentially flip the direction of the vector that we calculate between the robot's current configuration and in this case the obstacle. And so in terms of why it is you might want to use a bowl repeller as opposed to a cone attractor, well, the answer is that these repellers really should only have local influence, right? Because the key use of these repellers is to have the robot avoid portions of space that would be near the obstacle. And so we don't want them to have the effect that they end up sort of discouraging the robot from exploring the space or from sort of using more of the space that's roughly around the obstacles but not so close that the robot would hit. And so for that reason, we could use something like a bowl repeller in order to limit the range of influence that the repeller has, to just be the space that's very close to the obstacle. And so in terms of what this approach to composed potential fields can look like, so here's an example that is similar to the case of the robot soccer that we looked at, where we have a planar configuration space with a start configuration and a goal configuration, and then these two darkened shapes are representing obstacles within the space. And so the way then that our potential fields could be visualized and understood is they could be plotted in using an additional axis. So the vertical axis in these three plots here indicates the potential energy that based on our attractor field for the start to the goal node, and then our two repeller fields for the two obstacles. And then by combining these potentials, you can see the resultant potential field that we've defined, where there's still that sloping essentially manifold within this potential field that would take the robot from the start configuration to the goal configuration. But then you can see that there's these two pillars that are included, which are the result of our adding the repeller fields. And so based on that potential field, then the gradient field that we'll get will have that nice behavior where if we apply gradient descent, we can avoid the two obstacles while still reaching the goal configuration. So let's kind of think about this back in terms of the robot soccer example, where let's imagine that we have our 2D configuration space. We have a start configuration, which is the current configuration of the robot, and then we have the goal configuration of the robot with two obstacles in the world. And if we represent the two obstacles using bull repellers in our potential field that have a limited weight, meaning that their effect will be constrained by what's illustrated with the red circles around each of these two obstacles, then as an exercise, maybe I'd recommend pausing the video here and seeing if you can work through what the expected planning behavior would be for our robot in this setup. All right, so now that you've had a chance to think about this, so in this particular case, because we have the cone attractor centered on the goal configuration, and these two bull repellers have essentially like a radius of influence that's constrained. In this particular case, the planner would actually move in a straight line path from the current configuration to the goal configuration. Instead, if we look at another case, let's think about what might happen in this case, where the radius of influence for our two bull repellers overlaps, and overlaps in such a way that it actually that these two radii are in what would have been the path of the robot from the current configuration to the goal configuration. So once again, maybe pause the video here and see if you can work through what the expected behavior would be in this case. All right, so now that you've had a chance to think about this case, this is an interesting one where what will actually happen, to some extent depending on the exact implementation, but what we should expect to happen is that the current robot would get stuck in what's referred to as a local minimum. So essentially the robot would move in a straight line path towards the goal, and then it would get stuck where those two spheres of influence from the bull repellers intersect. And the reason for that is that would be a portion of configuration space that's known as arriving at a local minimum, where the potential field would no longer be decreasing in any direction at that point. And so we can imagine this conceptual diagram is sort of illustrating that, where the robot's path is illustrated by the black line, where then it gets stuck and it can't quite reach the goal because there's these sort of boundaries around it. And so that's what was happening in the case we looked at on the last slide, but just instead of physical boundaries, it was boundaries in the potential field, where the gradient descent was getting stuck in a local minimum. But let's look at another couple examples. So here's another case. This is a good one to think through. So you can see the radius of influence on each of our now 4 obstacles is smaller once again. So see if you can draw out or kind of trace out what you would expect the path to be if we were applying a gradient descent planner here. So in this particular case, the robot I don't expect to get stuck in a local minimum, and it would have a nice behavior where we would smoothly kind of move around the obstacles that we have and would reach the goal location. So one more case that would be, I think, good to think about is this one. So once again, pause the video, see if you can trace out what you'd expect the path to be, and then I'll talk through it. So in this case, what would likely happen is, once again, the robot would likely get stuck at a local minimum, right? So we have this portion of the configuration space here where the robot wouldn't be able to pass through these obstacles, but it's along the straight line path to the goal. So likely the potential field that we would implement would actually cause the robot to reach some local minimum in this portion of the space where my cursor is, and likely not reach the goal. So this should motivate us thinking about how it is we could still use these potential fields, which give us this nice smooth, this sort of smooth space for our planning algorithms to work in, and an easy way to compose different objectives within our planner, but with a way to account for these potential local minima. So now let's look at a few examples of these types of scenarios that have been implemented in MATLAB, so we can build some more intuition. So this example we looked at was the conical attractor, where there would be nice straight line planning motion that would result from our planner, from our gradient descent planner. But we can also implement our composed potential fields within, for example, MATLAB or other visualization software, and we can once again experiment with gradient descent. So in this case, once again, the robot doesn't get stuck in a local minimum here, so it's able to actually descend the potential field despite these three conical repeller obstacles that have been implemented, and it's able to avoid those obstacles but still reach the goal configuration. However, there are alternative cases that we were talking about, where the robot can get stuck in this local minimum. And so this is the case then that we want to think about, is how we can address these types of scenarios with our potential field planners. So let's now look at how it is that we could approach this problem of getting out of local minimum within potential field planners. And the answer is to go back to some of the planning approaches that we looked at earlier in the semester. And in particular, what we can do is we can look at graph-based search. So one potential approach that we're going to talk about is what's referred to as wavefront planning. And so at a high level, the idea is that we can discretize the potential field into a grid, and then we can store in each of the cells of that grid the cost to the goal with respect to this potential field. And so this overall discretization into a grid can be computed by the brushfire algorithm, which is essentially breadth-first search, just with the inclusion of these potential field scores. And once we've created this potential field grid, we can then treat it as grid search or graph search to find the final navigation plan from the start configuration to the goal configuration. So let's look at an example of how this can work. So within this wavefront planning, one slight caveat that we're gonna introduce is we're going to sort of plan backwards. So we're going to start from the goal location, and as we construct the wavefront, what we'll do is we'll move towards the starting configuration. And so what this does is it will ensure that we can avoid any local minimum within our resulting graph search. So for this particular case, we're starting at the goal location in the lower left portion of the configuration space, which is marked with a 2, which will be the starting energy at the goal configuration. And we're going to move then, we're going to create this brush fire towards the start configuration, which is in the upper right-hand corner of the configuration space and marked with a 0. In addition, what we'll do is each of the obstacles within the world will be marked with a 1 to denote that they're obstacles. And so what we can do now in this algorithm, the way that the brushfire algorithm will work, is it'll start at the goal configuration and work its way towards the start configuration, where the energy at each of the empty cells along the frontier is going to be defined as the current energy at the frontier that extends into that new cell, plus the change in energy from the current cell to that new cell. And so that's where the inclusion of the potential field comes into play. So the potential field defines then that gradient, that change between these two discretized points in our grid. So for the purposes of this demonstration, let's just for simplicity define the change in cell energy to be the constant of 1 in this case. So what the brushfire algorithm will do is it's going to now move to the next frontier of cells and kind of continually place in these cell energies to build up this grid. So it'll slowly grow away from the goal configuration until eventually it has built up the entire grid and reached the start configuration. And so at this point, what you can do is you can then perform graph search, just as we looked at earlier in the semester, to find then a path through this discretized representation of the potential field that leads from the start location to the goal location. And so the advantage of building the brushfire grid up map in this way, starting from the goal location and moving towards the start location, is that it will ensure that we can avoid local minimum when we go towards our graph search. So to look at an example with local minimum, let's consider a configuration space that looks like this. So the brushfire algorithm will first proceed. So we'll build up our discretized representation of the potential field. And the thing then that I'd like to point out is that you can see that at these two positions that we've highlighted with pink, these pink arrows, these would be local minimum. And so what we'll do with our graph search is we can ensure that we're avoiding these local minimum in the way that we structured that brushfire algorithm. So in this case, the brushfire algorithm is going to move along the path that avoids these 2 points within configuration space. So one thing I'll point out is that our 2D path planning environment actually is compatible with an implementation of the Wavefront planner. So one of the former students in this class actually, as an advanced extension, implemented the Wavefront planner within their path planning algorithms, and so the output from that is shown on this figure. And I think this is a really, really cool advanced extension. So if you're interested in exploring this, this could be one potential idea for you to look at. So given that now we can see the Wavefront planner is useful for potential field navigation within these 2D planar configuration spaces, the natural question then that we would want to look at next is whether or not we could extend potential field planning for navigation of more complicated configuration spaces. For example, the configuration space of a robotic arm. So how would we try and approach that problem of extending potential fields for robot arms? So there's a few things that we would need to consider. So the first thing is we would need to define the end effector goal as the attractive potential, potentially using a cone potential as we did for the 2D workspace, where the cone now is going to be defined over that larger dimensional configuration space. In addition, we could define repulsive potentials with respect to collision objects within the world. So we could select, so in order to do this, we could select points on the robot links with bowl potential from the nearest object, right? So we'd have to calculate for each of those points what the nearest object in the world is to define these potentials. And then once again, we could use our manipulator Jacobian to transform the potential at each point into velocities at the robot joints, and then you take the weighted sum of these transformed velocities to generate a control term. And so one of the challenges with taking this approach is that you're going to sort of at each one of these steps, you're going to have to deal with this larger dimensional configuration space, which could have some challenges when you try and define your potential fields. But conceptually, this approach should work. So I think another really cool advanced extension would be if you wanted to implement a potential field planner within our Kniva workspace that would work with the Wavefront planner. That would be another approach for an advanced extension that I would be really, really interested in seeing, that I think could have some really nice results. So to recap this broad topic of navigation that we've looked at throughout the course, let's just kind of briefly walk through the various approaches and algorithms that we've looked at. So we, at the sort of most reactive level, we looked at the bug algorithms, which had the nice properties of being complete algorithms, so they would find a solution if one exists, but they're non-optimal, and they were limited to that reactive based control. We then talked about subsumption and finite state machines, right? And so these were nice in that they were also reactive, so they were fast, but the challenge was in designing them and also in incorporating sensor information to be more deliberative. And so in addition to that, we looked at graph search algorithms, which now we've just recapped with the Wavefront planner. And so one big bonus of these is that they can work in general configuration spaces. The downside, of course, is that they will suffer from the curse of dimensionality. And so finding ways to address that curse of dimensionality becomes obviously a kind of crucial design consideration within the implementation of these in practice. There's also a random walk algorithm that we saw in a few examples that even was successful. So eventually, if you can afford the time, even something as simple as random walk can in some cases be successful. And then towards the end of the class, the two big topics that we looked at, so in today's lecture, potential fields, and then in the last lecture, sampling-based approaches to planning, we're sort of on the more advanced topics that we looked at for planning and configuration space. And so both of these had nice properties, but also some challenges with the implementation, which we're now getting some experience with in our next assignment. So our final programming assignment is going to be all about RRT and RRT Connect, where we'll be implementing these sampling-based approaches to planning for our robotic arm. And so with that will conclude our lecture on potential fields for planning within our robot operating systems. Next time, we're going to be looking at collision detection and discussing how we can implement collision detection within our Knievel stencil for Project 6. And so with that, thank you for watching today's lecture, and I look forward to seeing you in class this week.